Hello, so welcome. Today we're going to be looking at pollution permits. So pollution permits is another form of government intervention. It's a really interesting area of government intervention. It's kind of like creating a capitalist market to fix a problem created by capitalism itself. So it's a really interesting kind of approach to correct market failure. So as always, we need to ask ourselves, why is the government intervening into this market, right? So take it right back to that first step. So if we think about something like emissions, then we need to think about, why does this market require government intervention? And that's a really simple question, mainly because of externalities. So we know that there is an externality in the market. We know that that externality is causing negative effects to those outside of the transaction. In terms of emissions, obviously that works kind of generationally, so we're not just looking at like an immediate market effect to those outside that private transaction, you're actually looking at a further generational effect as well, which adds kind of like an interesting dynamic to the market itself. So one of the ways that we look at pollution permits themselves is we have to think about, well, what would happen if there wasn't pollution permits, right? So if we were in a situation like this one here, so kind of ignore all the rest of it for now, don't worry, we'll go through it, but we're just going to start here. So here we have two firms in the market. Now obviously it could be way more complex and have like 15 or 16 firms in the market, but for now we're just going to focus, really simplify it on two firms in the market. So there are two firms in the market, you've got firm A and firm B, and both of them are emitting 100 units of kind of emissions per year. And the government has decided that that's way too much and they need to intervene in the market, reduce that negative externality and cut the amount of emissions. So they're going to do what we kind of call a cap policy, right? So they're just going to cap the amount of emissions in the market by 50%, right? So they're going to say to both firms, you need to cut your emissions by 50%. Now, we might assume that there's only two firms in the market and we might assume that they have 50% of the market share each. That's really the only assumption that we can make. Firms have different kind of average costs, marginal costs. Firms have different kind of like setups within their firms that affects their costs. And one of the things that we can make an assumption of, just to kind of prove our point here, is that firm A has increasing costs, right? So they're experiencing diseconomies of scale, and firm B have decreasing costs. So they are experiencing economies of scale, and they're diminishing costs over time. So we have to have a look at, they are given 50 kind of pollution permits each and they're not allowed to trade. So they're just told you have to cut your emissions in half and that is it. So firm A, who has increasing costs, for them to cut from 100 to 50, it's going to cost them £20,000, right? They're experiencing increasing costs, so the more they cut by, the more it's going to cost them proportionally to be able to do that. And for firm B, they are having diminishing costs, so decreasing costs over time, and therefore for them to reduce by 50, it's going to cost them 15,000 units, and then we'll see that actually we have 50 and 50. So the total cost in the market for reducing their emissions by 50% is going to be £35,000. Now, obviously that could be like in millions or hundreds of millions, but it doesn't matter, it's 35,000 for now. But is that the best way, right? Is that the best way for the most cost-effective and the most efficient way for this market to run? So let's have a look if instead we have a cap policy, we actually have a cap and trade policies, and kind of a colloquial term that we use for pollution permits. What that basically means is that they have 50 pollution permits each. Pollution permit basically just means permission to pollute. So they have 50 units which they have permission to be able to pollute. But actually they can switch and trade, so they've capped and then they can trade those pollution permits between the two of them. So let's have a look. So because firm A is experiencing increasing costs, right? So their costs are increasing over time. The more they produce, the higher their costs at an increasing rate, right? So their costs are kind of increasing in a convex curve. If they decide to, instead of cutting by 50, they only cut by 25, then they only is going to cost them an 8,000, right? So rather than 20, it's going to cost them 8, because obviously they're experiencing increasing costs at an increasing rate. So therefore, obviously, if they decrease, it's going to cut less than half or less than proportionally. And firm B, they have a decreasing, so the more that they kind of cut by, the proportionally it's going to cost them less marginally each time, right? So obviously, instead of it being 15,000 for them to cut to 75 units, so for them to cut an additional 25 on top of the 50, it's only going to cost them an additional 5,000, right? So it's only going to cost them an additional 5,000 to cut by a further 25 units, whereas for these, for firm A, if they only cut by 25 instead of 50, it's going to cost them 8,000 rather than 20, right? So it's going to, essentially what you're saying is for them to cut their emissions by an additional 25, it's going to cost them 12,000 because they have increasing costs. So essentially, it is more beneficial for the market for them to split the way that they are cutting the emissions. So rather than it being 35,000, it's going to cost them 28,000 combined, which is a much cheaper alternative for the market. However, obviously, firm B is incurring an extra 5,000 and firm A is reducing by 12,000. So therefore, there needs to be an incentive for firm A to kind of add on that additional 5,000 for them to cut further. So one of the ways that can be an incentive is for firm A to say, do you know what, we'll pay that additional 5,000 for you, and not only will we pay that 5,000 for you, but we'll give you a more than 5,000, so you're not kind of indifferent, you definitely want to kind of give it a go. So they might say that it's additional plus a half, so, you know, time and a half or for it. So instead of it being 5,000, we will give you 7,500, right? So therefore firm B is incentivized to give some of their pollution permits to firm A. So as we can see here, I've kind of broken it down a little bit. So firm A is going to pay firm B the additional 7,500, which is their kind of, oh, here's your extra 25 units that you can reduce your emissions by, and we'll also give you 2,500 incentive for spending that 5,000 there with you, so that you are incentivized to make sure that you reduce that cost. And therefore firm A has their 8,000 plus the 7,500 that they're paying firm B, and therefore their costs are 15,500, which, as you can see, is less than if they were to cut by 50. And for firm B, their cost is 12,500, because that's the 20,000 minus the 7,500 that firm A is going to cost them. Well, that's 12,500, which is also less than the 15,000 that just cutting by 50 would cost them. And therefore, both firm A and firm B will be incentivized to split their emissions and to pay each other for the cost of those emissions, for the cost of those permits. So they're on board with doing it, and equally, it's going to cost less overall for the market to reduce their emissions. So rather than having 50-50, have it cut in half in this situation, you're actually better off with firm A, because they have increasing costs, or increasing at an increasing rate, emitting 75, and firm B emitting 25, and obviously overall there is still the same kind of permitted pollution in the market. So we can see from this example that actually a cap policy introduced in the market is not the most efficient way for everyone in the market to reduce their emissions, and actually a cap and trade policy reduces emissions but also is effective for both firms cost-wise. They're more likely to want to do it that way, and it's just a more efficient outcome for the market. So therefore cap and trade can be incredibly useful and incredibly kind of efficient for everybody in the market, and incentivize firms to lower their emissions at a more effective rate than just kind of capping. So how do we talk about this in your exam? Because we're not going to expect you to do all the maths and to work it out and to draw all of these diagrams, but we are going to expect you to basically understand that you have two kind of brackets of firms in the market that are important. So your two kind of bracket of firms is you have an underpolluter and you have an overpolluter. So your underpolluter is the one who's going to trade some of their pollution permits. And the overpolluter, so firm A in that case, or kind of the polluter where the cost of them reducing their emissions is much higher, is going to be the buyer of pollution permits. And obviously that's going to have effect on the market and those firms overall. So as we saw before, the underpolluter is going to be the seller of their pollution permits, and the overpolluter is going to be the buyer of pollution permits. So the underpolluter is going to sell their pollution permits to the overpolluter, and because of that, their overall cost of producing their good or service to the market is going to fall. Now you might think that it's actually their revenue that shifts out, but it's not their revenue that shifts out, because their revenue is their AR curve, their demand curve for whatever they're selling at the end goods, whether that's kind of, energy or anything else that they're selling at the end. Therefore, their revenue received from selling units of electricity or gas or whatever is not going to change from them selling pollution permits. But what is going to change is the overall amount of kind of money that it costs them to produce that service or that good, because they've received income from selling some of their pollution permits. So therefore, what's going to happen is it's actually going to reduce their overall costs of production in their whole kind of market that they're selling in, rather than it being like a shift out of their average revenue. And you'll kind of see why in a moment. So instead of having our high MC or AC, the underpolluters MC and AC is both going to fall. The rules kind of still apply. Try and aim for your AC to hit halfway. I know it's super hard, but the examiner will appreciate just the effort of you trying to show that that's happening. So obviously, as we can see here, we have a new production point, we have a new profit maximizing position, which gives us a new quantity. So the firm is now able to produce more than they were previously, and they're able to do that at a lower cost to the market, right? So their price, for their overall price for whatever good or service that they are producing, has been able to fall, and their profits have been able to rise because of the fall in their costs. However, for the overpolluter or the polluter where they have a higher cost for them to reduce their pollution, they have to buy pollution permits. So what is going to happen for them? Pause the video, have a go, see what you think is going to happen. So we should have seen you increasing obviously their costs, because they have to buy these pollution permits. We saw previously that for the firm they had to pay the 7,500, so therefore their costs are going to rise. So we see here their marginal cost is going to rise, and also their average cost is going to rise. Now you might think, why is it just there? Why is it a marginal cost? Why is it not the average cost? Well, it's easy to think and kind of understand that as they produce more to the market, obviously they're going to have to buy more pollution permits, and therefore it is a marginal cost and not a fixed cost for the firm. So therefore their MC and their AC is going to increase. And once again, the same as before, because we've had our MC increase, that does give us a new profit maximizing position, which is here. So for this firm here, they are going to be able to produce less because their costs have risen, and equally because of that, we can see that their prices have had to rise. So it's gone from this one here, their price has had to rise, and also the amount of supernormal profit they are making has fallen. So that kind of adds like another incentive for firms to become more emission friendly, because the firm who's selling their pollution permits is actually able to offer their goods or services to the market at a much lower price, which would indicate that they will have an increase in the consumers in the market if we assume that there is like high consumer switching, not that much irrational consumer behaviour, etc. And for the firm that's having to buy pollution permits, they're having to incur the cost of their emissions, and equally on top of that, they're also having to charge a higher price to the market, and therefore they will lose consumers. We can see that they have had a movement along their demand curve, and there is less quantity that has been demanded in there for their product or service compared to their kind of rival in the market. So firms have an incentive to lower their cost, because then obviously they can lower their prices and they get more consumers if they're lowering their prices. But equally, firms have an incentive to maximise their profit. If their cost is rising, then they're not going to be able to maximise their profits. So pollution permits kind of add additional element of like the reason why firms are going to try and become more emission friendly or lower emissions, more environmentally friendly, because it means that they're able to gain more supernormal profit, but also there's a rivalry kind of element to it as well, where they don't want to lose their consumer base to a rival in the market. So what is the most important part? What is the most kind of key thing to pollution permits? What is the one thing that can make pollution permit market completely fall apart? Well, it is the price of the permits. So obviously, as the government introduce the permit to the market, they will set kind of a minimum price that those permits can be sold by. So whatever the firm is going to buy from the government, whatever the pollution permit price is, they're going to buy from the government, they have to make sure that they're selling that for a higher price than they bought it for. So they have to make sure that they're making a small kind of profit on selling those pollution permits. And that price is so essential. Think about what would happen if that price was too low, for instance. So if the price was too low, there'd be no incentive for anybody to become a non-polluter, because the price of permits would be lower than the cost of becoming a non-polluter, and therefore they would just buy all the permits and would have no incentive to actually become a non-polluter, because it's cheaper for them to do that. So if the price of the permits is too low, those people who are buying the permits will just continue to buy the permits and won't actually reduce the amount that they are kind of polluting. Equally, think about what might happen if the price of permits were too high. Well, if the price of permits were too high, those people who want to buy the permits to sell them, those who are under-polluters or those who it is cheaper to become a non-polluter or to reduce the amount of emissions below the cap in the market, they won't want to buy them in the first place, because the difference between the amount that they can buy sell them for compared to what they bought them for will be very minimal, and it won't be worth the effort of them buying to sell them. So you have to make sure that the price of pollution permits to the market is at the right level, because otherwise, if they're too high, then the market will fail, and if they're too low, then the market will fail as well. And when I say market, I mean the market for pollution permits. So the pollution permit market will not work. But overall, it's such a kind of finicky price. When it works so well. But overall, what you need to happen, the most essential thing of the market is, in the long run, so not in the short run, but in the long run price of pollution permits. So if this firm here had to continuously buy pollution permits from now until the end of time, needs to be higher, right? So that long run price for this firm over here needs to be higher than the long run price for them to become a non-polluter, right? That's so important for this market to work, to get rid of the externality. Because if the price, so the long run price of the pollution permit needs to be higher, needs to be greater than the long run price of reducing emissions, because if that was the other way around, if the long run price of reducing emissions was greater than the price of permits, then this firm here would never reduce their emissions. They would have no incentive to reduce the amount of emissions that they are bringing to the market, right? So long run, the continual cost of having to buy all of these pollution permits has to be greater than the cost of reducing your emissions, because if it didn't do that, if you weren't in a situation where that happened, there would be no incentive for this firm to actually reduce their emissions. Their incentive would be just to be continuously buying pollution permits from this seller here. So for the market to work overall, and by the market to work overall, I mean the externality in the market to reduce overall, you need to make sure that the long run cost of buying permits is greater than the long run cost of buying emissions, because then this firm will eventually become a non-polluter too. So the last thing that we're going to have a look at is some examples of when this has worked and some research for you to kind of do on your own and to see how useful pollution permits can be to reduce emissions. So this is sulfur dioxide in America. The first Bush administration in 1992, I think, put pollution permits in the market for sulfur dioxide. It was incredibly successful, and actually they hit their target of reducing sulfur dioxide. Research into the market, it's really, really useful. It's really interesting for you to be able to see a working example of pollution permits kind of being successful government intervention. So thank you so much for watching. I hope that it's been useful for you to watch this, and I will see you next week when we have a look at more government intervention. Bye!